God bless you, friends. Today we're talking about how lasting relationships require forgiveness. Sadly, most relationships have an expiration date. The reality is that there is a great portion of marriages that end in divorce that would be considered low conflict marriages. There was no physical or verbal abuse. There was no addiction problems. There was no unfaithfulness. You know, when we think of divorce and problems in homes and problems in marriages, our mind often just automatically goes to these great big problems that just would tear a home apart or tear a marriage apart. But the reality is that there is a large portion of marriages that end in divorce that actually come from low conflict homes. See, when we talk about relationships, it's not a question of will conflict arise or will someone make a mistake, because in this imperfect world that is full of imperfect people, we all make mistakes. We all have bad attitudes sometimes. We all allow our flesh at some level to get the best of us from time to time. Friends, forgiveness is a must if we want to have lasting relationships. We are focusing on low conflict marriages. We're talking about typical common conflicts and relationship struggles that we all deal with from time to time. Trying to have a relationship without forgiveness is like trying to build a brick wall without mortar. That wall's going to crumble. That wall's not going to be strong. As our marriages and relationships will also be weak and crumble and fall apart if we don't exchange grace and mercy with one another. In most homes, the phrase, "Will you forgive me?" and the phrase, "I forgive you," are rarely used, if used at all. It should be a normal thing in our homes to say, "I'm sorry. Will you forgive me? I forgive you." We'll talk more about some of these phrases when we teach about communication, because communication is key to having healthy relationships. But do you use the phrase, "Please forgive me"? Do you use the phrase, "I'm sorry"? Think about that for a moment right now. Think of the last time that you used the word or the phrase, "I'm sorry. Will you forgive me?" Let's look at this for a moment. The greatest relationship that has ever existed is the relationship that God has with the church, the relationship that He desires to have with all humanity. For those of us who have chosen to be a part of the family of God, we have entered into a relationship with God and been a part of the most beneficial relationship anyone could ever have. But if you take forgiveness and grace and mercy out of the equation, then that great, amazing relationship that God has with the church doesn't exist. When we exchange mercy and grace, it draws us closer to one another. It draws us closer, unifies us, makes us strong. Forgiveness means to pardon. For relationships to have the possibility to be long-lasting relationships, then we're going to have to pardon one another. We're going to have to make room for each other's shortcomings, for each other's bad days. There has to be an exchange of grace and mercy between us and those that live under the same roof that we do. Paul wrote to the church of Ephesus and to the church of Colossae in Ephesians 4:32 and Colossians 3:13. And he tells them to forgive one another just as the Lord has forgiven you. See, most of us are okay with receiving grace, but we're not too quick to give grace. We are frustrated when those close to us don't come and apologize and ask us to forgive them. We're right, they're wrong. They had a bad attitude with us. They were short. Whatever the case might be, we're frustrated because they won't take the first step. They won't humble themselves and ask for grace. They won't humble themselves and say, "I'm sorry." But when the tables are turned, friends, do you reach out? Do you humble yourself and ask for forgiveness? Think about your marriage. Do you ever say, "Hey babe, will you forgive me?" "Hey baby, I'm sorry." Think about your immediate family for a moment. Your children. Do they ever hear you say to your spouse, to their mom, or to their father, "I'm sorry, will you forgive me?" Do you set the example for them of what a godly individual sounds like and looks like? Do you ever say, "I'm sorry" to your children? Do you ever ask your children to forgive you? Come on, parents, we're not perfect. Do your children ask one another for forgiveness? If you're not willing to humble yourself and extend grace, then your relationships likely have an expiration date. Humble yourselves. Exchange mercy and grace. We're talking about low conflict homes. Things that won't matter a week, 2 weeks, a month down the road, a year down the road. But when we don't show grace and mercy in low conflict situations, then over time, those low conflict homes, the level of conflict increases. Bitter hearts are developed. And an atmosphere for relationships to fall apart is developed instead of an atmosphere where relationships can thrive. Parents, set the example in your home. Lead your family closer to God by the way you humble yourselves. It's time to make family first.